Have you ever stared at your paycheck and wondered where exactly all those tax deductions are actually going? Or maybe you've been driving down a brand new, freshly paved highway and suddenly thought about the massive, almost incomprehensible financial engine it takes to make that happen. Well, today, we are going to unpack that exact engine in this explainer on fiscal policy. We've got a lot of ground to cover. We'll be mapping out the public finance blueprint, how taxes fuel the state, who really bears the tax burden, the different tax trajectories out there, how public spending actually drives growth, and finally, how governments manage all those debts and deficits. Let's get into it. Section 1. The Public Finance Blueprint. Let's lay the foundation. To really understand this, think of the government as a massive circulatory system for the economy. On the collection side, you've got fueling the state through revenue and taxation. That's the intake. Then on the distribution side, you've got investing in progress through expenditure and debt management. Essentially, the government draws funds in through various tax structures and then pumps them right back out to drive production, equity, and stability, funding things like infrastructure, education, and social security. At its absolute core, this is what we call public finance. It's just the study of the cash flow of public authorities, and that could be your federal government, your state legislature, or even your local municipal board. Basically, any public authority that performs core functions, maintaining law and order, providing defense, promoting economic development, well, they need funds to do that, and public finance is all about how they get and use those funds. Now, governments don't just sit on a giant pile of cash. They deploy it actively through fiscal policy. This means they are strategically adjusting the main levers, taxation, spending, and borrowing, to accelerate production or, sometimes, to act as a shock absorber when the economy gets rocky. They're using these instruments to hit massive economic objectives, like keeping employment high and keeping the overall economy stable. Which brings us to Section 2, Fueling the State Through Taxes. So where does the fuel come from? Economist E.R.A. Seligman completely nailed the definition of a tax. I want you to notice the second half of his quote. Without reference to special benefits conferred, it's a compulsory contribution, meaning you can't pay $1,000 in income tax and expect a $1,000 personalized receipt of specific government services in return. It's not a subscription service. You're funding the general ecosystem for the common interest of everyone. Up next is Section 3, the tax burden pipeline, or more simply, who actually ends up paying. Taxes generally split into two main lanes: direct and indirect. Direct taxes are locked directly onto you. Think income tax or wealth tax. You pay it and you bear the burden. Simple, right? But indirect taxes are levied on expenditures. So the initial payer, let's say a manufacturer, pays it first, but they eventually pass the buck down the line. And this brings up an absolutely crucial distinction in economics: impact versus incidence. With a direct tax, the impact and the incidence hit the exact same person. But with an indirect tax, like a goods and services tax, the initial impact hits the producer. However, that cost jumps node by node down the supply chain until the final incidence lands squarely on the final consumer. Ultimately, you're the one absorbing that cost at the checkout counter. Section 4, Income Scales and Tax Trajectories. Let's talk about how we scale these numbers. Governments basically scale taxes using four main trajectories. They can keep it proportional with a flat, constant rate for everyone. They can make it progressive by taxing higher incomes at higher rates. There's regressive, which actually ends up penalizing lower incomes more heavily. And finally, degressive, which is a hybrid. It starts out progressive, but eventually caps off at a flat limit. When you visualize this, the progressive model looks a bit like a rocket ship. As income rises, the tax percentage just keeps climbing. This is highly elastic. It automatically boosts government revenue during economic booms, and it actively helps reduce wealth inequality. Now contrast that with the degressive curve. It climbs at first, but then it hits a hard ceiling. This is actually a very practical model, and it's the one used by systems like the Indian income tax.
All right, Section 5, Driving Growth with Public Spending.
It is so easy to view taxation as just money leaving our pockets into the void. But public expenditure is absolutely not a black hole. It's a highly calculated, vital tool that governments use to maintain our collective needs and the overall economic welfare of the citizens. When a government spends, it triggers a massive ripple effect. Just by buying goods and paying salaries, the government generates immediate demand and income for everyday people. Spending on things like education and healthcare directly increases the productive efficiency of the entire national workforce. They can also develop heavy industries or provide subsidies that stimulate private investment in areas like agriculture.
Plus, through welfare programs and pensions, public spending actively works to distribute income more equitably across the whole population.
So this brings us right back to that core balancing act. Public expenditure is what economists call an anti-cyclical stabilizer. Basically, think of it as a macroeconomic seesaw. In a depression, the government will intentionally spike its spending, maybe kicking off massive infrastructure projects to artificially boost demand and get people working. But during an inflationary boom, they'll pull back on spending to cool the engines down. It is a constant strategic balancing act.
Section 6. Managing debts and deficits.
Okay, so what happens when a government wants to spend more money than it actually takes in? That creates a gap. To cross this gap, governments utilize something called deficit financing. This just means they meet the shortfall either by borrowing money from the public and financial institutions, or, in some very specific scenarios, by actually printing new money.
Naturally, borrowing money doesn't come for free. It creates public debt. This is the accumulated tab that a government owes. It could be owed internally to its own subjects, like everyday people in domestic banks, or externally to the nationals and institutions of other countries.
Obviously, a government can't just stay in debt forever. They have to manage and eventually redeem it, and they've got a strategic toolkit for this. They might use refunding, which is essentially kicking the can down the road by issuing brand new bonds to pay off the old ones. Debt conversion swaps out high-interest debt for lower rates. They might set up a sinking fund, diligently depositing annual revenues to prepare for when bonds mature. Or, in absolute total emergencies, they might drop a capital levy, which is a massive, one-time heavy tax on wealth. Zooming all the way out, it's pretty clear that managing this whole ecosystem is a perpetual balancing act. The government is constantly adjusting the dials of public revenue and public expenditure, trying to strike this perfect harmony that promotes immediate economic growth without sacrificing long-term social welfare. It truly is the ultimate balancing act of a nation's present needs against its future prosperity. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to think about. Armed with this new understanding of tax pipelines, progressive rates, and public expenditure stabilizers, how will you view your own role in this grand financial blueprint the next time you look at your paycheck or drive on a public road? Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning how the world works.